Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here with us still. We do have an increased number of people in the room, so that is really great, as well as online. We are the last panel, the last but not the least, a very powerful panel. We have powerful speakers, and they are going to share the perspective, especially around the theme and the symposium today on philosophies, histories, and possibilities, Woman, Life, Freedom Symposium. We'll kickstart with the first presentation, and I will introduce the speaker. And then we'll, after the two speakers, or three speakers rather, we'll take questions at the end. And given that this is the last session, part of it also especially is around a call to action and what we can do going forward as well, especially in terms of solidarity and supporting the movement. For the fourth speaker, Dr. Nilofar Sahi, who is going to present on totalitarianism and women's rights from an intersectional perspective, a case study of Afghanistan. Dr. Sahi is a professorial lecturer of international affairs at the Elliott School of George Washington University. She is also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, as well as served as course coordinator and instructor at the U.S. Department of State's Foreign Service Institute. She has taught at George Mason University and American University of Afghanistan, and she has also served as a country director of the Open Society Foundation Afghanistan office and an executive director at the American University of Afghanistan, where she serves now as a trustee. You're welcome, Dr. Sahi, to present on totalitarianism and women's rights from an intersectional perspective, a case study, Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for a very generous introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here till almost the end of Friday. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the Dayton University for organizing this meaningful, valuable, timely, and important symposium, where at least many of women in the region I work, South Central Asia, they are suffering from severe oppression, and they are fighting and struggling for their basic human rights. My thoughts and prayers are with all those in Iran and Afghanistan who are fighting totalitarian systems, who are struggling for their basic rights. And with the recent changes, of course, in the region with Afghanistan and Iran, where women stood high to struggle and to take their basic human rights from systems which don't have any respect for them. So I would wish them all the best, and sending them prayers and thoughts and strength in this very critical time in their history. I'm going to talk from an intersectional perspective, because I believe that women's lives cannot be explained by taking into account the single social category or political category, such as race, socioeconomic conditions, and where women belong to. But people's lives in general, and women in particular, are multidimensional and complex, especially in countries where it is the systems are based on a patriarchal positions and status, and where the politics are designed in a way to maintain and protect the patriarchal nature of societies. So therefore, I think in such context, especially where the patriarchy is there, where there are political systems which impose certain belief to suppress women and limit and confine women to particular boundaries, and where the tradition and norms and values are, on the other hand, inhibiting women to have equal access to resources, and at the top of everything, with their own religion, is creating boundaries. So therefore, all these factors make us think about the intersectionality of this particular issue in those countries. So therefore, I'm discussing women's rights in particular in the case of a totalitarian system, because that's how, at least in two countries that we see, Iran and Afghanistan recently, of how this system are going to react to women's rights and what it means, what these historical factors actually impacted, and what this current system of totalitarianism or authoritative systems or regime are going to impact and further oppress women in these countries. So the reason I brought this particular framework, the intersectionality, also to understand better the layers of discrimination and oppression that's not only caused by the systematic approach of politics, but by the systematic societal factors as well, which comes from history, for the historical dynamics that exist in the country, and also from the traditional notion of society. The other reason I think that intersectional lens is important to understand women's rights in such contexts, especially to understand the historical context where women live and the historical context surrounding women's rights violation. So, and long histories of violence and systematic discrimination in most of the countries where they rely on the traditionalism still, they have created deep inequalities that disadvantage some from the outset. And these inequalities then intersect with each other. For example, the poverty, a constant change of regime, institution change, racism, and sexism, they are all coming together and denying people, and women in particular, their rights and equal opportunities. So the intersectional perspective overall gives us a lot of direction and better understand the historical discrimination, the societal discrimination, the discriminations imposed by politics and institutions, and overall, the most important thing, the social factors with religion and culture is coming in part of it. So they all overlap, and that describes the nature of oppression that women face in particular society. So first, the totalitarianism. The nature of totalitarian system overall is to limit the freedom and agency of the population. Why? Because totalitarians, by suppressing progressive, by suppressing the voices and agency of population, they sustain their regime. And in such a system, people's capacity for conviction is destroyed. And women become irrelevant in politics and public sector, because it's all about power dynamics. And you have to, as a totalitarians believe that they have to suppress a portion of society in order to create obedient masses. And the obedient masses are the tool for sustaining their regime. So that's the overall philosophy behind sustaining their regime. So that the obedient segment of society could be two in general, the progressives and women. I mean, especially in countries where they have equal percentage of women and men. For example, in case of Afghanistan, there hasn't been any census, but in many of the reports and data, we have seen that 50% of population is women. Again, I mentioned that there hasn't been any census to clarify that. So with 50% of population, I mean, converting that 50% population into obedient masses, that itself, it means that partly sustaining a system of ruling over 50% of the population. So that comes from the ideological belief behind totalitarian system, which is overall to limit the freedom and agency of the population and to convert the population, including progressives, into a obedient masses to sustain the power and rule. So based on this ideology, women are the soft power for such system. Then in such system, women are needed, by the way. Again, as I mentioned, women are needed because they want a large percentage of the population to be obedient masses, inactive obedient masses. So women are needed, but needed in certain limitations. We meant that to make them confined to childbearing and adding numbers to the masses. So it's about increasing the population size by increasing an obedient masses to sustain a regime. That's how the ideology around limiting women's power come under totalitarianism. On the other hand, totalitarian regime, they have the obsessive and aggressive quest for control of women's bodies, fertility, and childbearing. The cases we have seen, we just see and experience now in Afghanistan case, that they release decrees and edicts on the, of course, the hijab, on different aspects of women's appearance in society, on the way women should dress up in public. So that kind of control over bodies, and recently the edicts that show that they have control on the fertility, so the childbearing. So they all come in sequence again in order to control a woman from all public spheres and sectors. So they may hold different worldview of push. There's pushed different content, but overall the strategy and the ideology is around limiting women and confining women to a particular sphere to convert them into obedient masses and large population of them. So therefore, if you just go back to the historical understanding of totalitarian system, we find a very clear example in Nazi Germany, which shows their thinking was based not only on racism, but on sexism too. Men and women at that particular time had very different roles in the Nazis' imagination, both of which had been assiduously engineered. And under such conditions, having a well-informed educated population is unimportant. So uneducated and uninformed women better served at that part in the history, the Nazis, their political vision, and of course that is an agenda of the totalitarian system also to create uninformed and uneducated segment of society, and women can play that role according to their agenda of it. So overall, totalitarianism as a system that creates more enabling conditions for women to lose their agency, to lose their power. I mean, the power of living as a independent, free woman is completely disappeared under such system, because the system overall undermines the women's agency of power, women's agency of participation, women's agency of freedom. So all these agencies are undermined through a systematic institutional approach. Either it could be through media, institutions, political institutions, or any other format of ethics, laws, policies to confine this particular population into certain spheres of life in order to create that obedient masses. That's a major agenda and ideology behind totalitarianism for sustaining their own regime. Now, this is one element. The politics of a system. If you just move a little bit to the case of Afghanistan, we see that overall, historically, from 1920s till now, the politics, any regime in Afghanistan, any political system in that country, it had an impact on women's agency. The systems overall, the political systems, if it were a moderate political system, they had change and shape women's agency in different direction. And if it was a restrictive, traditional religious system, that has created further oppression and suppression for women in society. So overall, the political institutions in Afghanistan historically has shaped women's agency, whatever agency they wanted to see in women. And on the other hand, it also created narratives of women's role in society, that what women can do and what women cannot do. That has put aside, that has just directed and guided by this political system historically. And now with the authoritative system, that becomes further confirmed, that the system is a follow-up of a traditional political system which could further suppress women and oppress women at different levels. In addition to this, there are other factors like traditionalism in societies, which again, I mentioned at the very beginning that patriarchy is one of the major factors that in many societies at the social level the women cannot take steps beyond the boundaries that are set forward to them by a patriarchal nature of society. So that is also patriarchy shapes people's behavior, patriarchy, and those people eventually they end up in politics, eventually they end up in institution. Patriarchy at the social level, they integrate certain values and norms in people's life that, again, women will be impacted by those values and norms. So patriarchy and severe patriarchy, the traditional in traditional society, that also becomes one of the major factors that shapes politics in that particular society. And then the politic will have its impact in creating women's right narrative for women's right and women's movement and women's participation in society. Now, with these new changes in Afghanistan, particularly in light of the recent one, there are historical one that one can go and discuss from the 1920, where women's movement started in Afghanistan, but then with different back and forth clashes in society and politics, with change in regime, change in administration, the narratives kept changing and changing. Now, with this, I would like to just focus a little bit on this recent changes since last 18 months in Afghanistan, with the Taliban takeover, and the 20 years, there was a different narrative built about women's rights in Afghanistan. Though, of course, that was also not perfect, but there were some level of changes and progress in the women's movement and the way women try to step in and create their own narratives about where they have to go. Though, again, that was not perfect, that was not complete, but lots of progress are related to that particular 20 years that one can relate to as building narratives for women's rights in Afghanistan. Though what has come up again and again, that women's rights in Afghanistan or women's movement in Afghanistan hasn't been organic, and that organic women's movement have to be developed in order to sustain itself. That has been always an issue in different time period in Afghanistan. Now, with this new changes, with the Taliban is a militant, traditional, extremist religious group in power from last 18 months, that has completely changed the women's rights situation in Afghanistan overall, created again a new set of ideas and belief about women's rights, which could shape narratives around women's rights in Afghanistan. So the factors I mentioned, they are the Taliban, the system that they rely on is a totalitarian system. It's a very hard totalitarian system where there's no room for women to be free and in a way that she wants to be, and enjoy and exercise her rights in society, both publicly, especially in the public sphere. So the Taliban overall ideology is even quite different from the many segments of Afghanistan. Sometimes there are different conflicting narratives around, or theories around, women's rights in Afghanistan. Some relate that, well, Afghanistan is a traditional society in general, in particular, therefore, and Taliban are implementing that particular traditional notion of society, which is not true. And then on the other hand, there are other views too. But overall, that's not true. Yes, Afghanistan has some, especially in some of the rural areas, have its own traditional mechanisms set forth for the women's right. But overall, the country is progressive in terms of it is women's basic rights to education, basic rights to some fundamental participation in job and education system. So there are conflicting theories and views about women's role in society from Afghanistan perspective traditionally, but overall, as I mentioned, that has to be studied further and to understand better. Taliban overall has put a very severe and strict rules on women's role in education, women's role at work, and they stopped women from politics. They stopped women from many public sectors, like mostly private. And as many of you know, the secondary education for girls are closed now. The women from universities are banned, and women from NGO sector are banned. So overall, there has been number of bans on women's social participation, public participation, and they confined and limited women at their houses with the same ideology, going back to totalitarian system, which I mentioned, that women are confined to the closed doors for and certain jobs and responsibilities are assigned to them as a woman, as a mother, but beyond that, they don't have any role in public life. So this is now, or here we can see the connections of how politics, which Taliban are launching through their own ideology and political systems, can create a narrative around women's role in society. If this will continue, then within the different layers in society, within social layers, like the people in itself, communities, they start believing that this is exactly what women's role are, and women are confined to certain boundaries because that's exactly where they belong to. So this belonging where, in which circle, in which position, in which segment of society, that becomes narrative by such imposition of the political orders from the top. And that has happened, by the way, historically too, but in totalitarian, because it is an authoritative system, because people are afraid and scared, because there are all kinds of tools and tactics to suppress the population from raising their voice, that becomes harder. The narratives around women take its root and place in society, and people start believing about certain narratives, which the top level, whoever is in top level or authority, they impose on them. So that is actually a fear mostly under totalitarianism, because, and if it continues, then the belief system in people, within people, that changes. And that can change the perception about women's agency in return, that women cannot do certain things because they are not meant to do certain things, or because they don't have the capacity, they don't have the capability, they don't have the strength and power, they are not meant for certain activity. So this division of job and responsibility, or division of role based on capabilities and incapabilities, that becomes a narrative which is imposed by a totalitarian system for a long term, if that institutionalized and it is formed, and which could come as a very in a long term would become difficult to change that narrative and perspective, because that is rooted so much in the social fabrics of society that people start believing in something. And when people believe in that, that becomes part of their integral part of their own understanding about their role and about other roles. And on the other hand, what happens to women's agency with such a totalitarian imposition of rules, regulations, and overall ideology? Women start believing in themselves if that continues. Again, if totalitarian system continues, women start believing that they cannot do something, and they are not meant for certain jobs, and that undermines their agency of confidence, the agency of freedom, the agency of participation, and that actually inhibits them to move forward and to take actions. So overall, it goes two ways. If the totalitarian imposition of ideology take its root in society, does not only change social fabrics, but does change the perceptions of men and women about their role in society, and especially women, and that will limit and inhibit women to move forward and take steps and raise their voice for rights. So these are the consequences of totalitarian system, which are interconnected with the social fabrics of society, with tradition, patriarchy altogether, and that develops and creates a certain belief system within women, which inhibits them to move forward, and that builds their agency and undermines their agency of power, independence, and freedom. Now, what has to be done? I mean, I'll stop after just a few points at the end. What has to be done? Well, such systems are totally against women's emancipation. And as I mentioned at the beginning, that they want a large number of population, but that obedient masses, not active participant or active women in society, or not powerful women in society. What they want is obedient masses in large number to sustain their regime. That's the goal of totalitarian system. And women as a massive population can serve that purpose of totalitarianism. Therefore, overall, the existence of such systems has a negative consequence on women's socio-political participation. And the things which has to be done is the organic movement of women against such operations. And that organic movement should start from the country, from the people who are there, supported by the man, especially in countries such as Afghanistan, and we have seen in Iran uprisings too, and that when many men supported women, what actually it changed the entire situation for the power structures too. So the change can come when there is a large, massive movement of men and women in support of women's right under such a system. If women stand alone, that of course will have very strong impact, but in societies where there are tradition and patriarchy is playing a massive role and suppression of population in large, men participation in supporting women in such cause becomes extremely important and critical in taking the movement forward, and also decentralizing the movement around the country, not focusing on one part and two part, because that could motivate, inspire the population in large in order to resist against a system which is undermining the basic rights of women. So the collective action, first of all, started organically from the country against such a regime is the first step. Then, of course, it should go beyond, and the others from the region, the others from the world should join such movement in order to resist the totalitarian policies or resist the totalitarian system in general. So, but that the entire attitude change, belief change, and perception change about women's rights, that should happen organically from inside, and the social fabrics should be the social institution that could have impact on social fabrics could take a major role in starting that organic movement to change the narratives first, to change the perception, and then that should take from there in order to expand all the series of activities plus the movement which could be against the totalitarian system. I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niloufar, for laying out the complexities of inequalities and women's rights in totalitarian regimes, particularly in the case of Afghanistan. I'm not going to try to recap your presentation, also given that we have limited time. However, we also appreciate you, especially in terms of thinking of what needs to be done, especially around organic organizing, but also in terms of the shared commonalities between Afghanistan, Iran, as well as elsewhere, where women's rights and inequalities continue to be deepened as well. At this point, I would like to welcome environmental philosopher Margaret Grebowick to present on Mountains and Desire. She is the author of several books, including Rescue Me, On Dogs and Their Humans, Mountains and Desire, Climate versus the End of the World, Whale Song, The National Park to Come, and Why Internet Porn Matters, as well as the co-author of Beyond the Cyborg, Adventures with Donna Haraway. Margaret has held professorships in the US as well as in Russia, and is currently an associate professor at the University of Silesia in Poland. You're welcome, Margaret. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a fantastic day, and thank you to the true believers who are still here at the end when we've been held in this really intense and fascinating conversation for for a long time now. So I'm grateful to you for being here still. And I've been invited here to speak specifically about the environment. I should say about myself that I'm probably the person furthest away from the conversation. So I hope that I'm able to kind of get us to zoom out a little bit and think about this connection between life and freedom in a sort of increasingly abstract way, or at least just for a second in a very abstract way. And to do that, I'm going to try to entertain you and entice you with some images. So if I could just, let's see. All right, here we go. I'm still new to, okay, so now, you guys should see my screen. Everything good? I don't hear you. I don't know what's going on.
We can see a black screen.
Yeah, now we can see a black screen.
That's perfect. That's been my work is done. Perfect. All right. The variety of reasons for which people come to Mount Everest, to climb or be near it, have in common the idea of reaching the top, a sort of superimposition of the ultimate heights of experience onto the highest point of the planet. This has in recent years become personified in the figure of the corporate jock, who has the money and the personal trainer to accept nothing less than 100% success, or the couple that travels all the way to base camp to get married. To many, the summit of Everest has become basic. But what is summiting really about? It's commonplace in much philosophy of climbing to make the distinction between climbing focused on summiting and climbing focused on relationships with the mountain, fellow climbers, and oneself. This distinction seems invariably accompanied by the understanding that the passion for summiting is both ethically and environmentally suspect. It's not about winning, we are told. It's about how you play the game. This tendency goes back to Karen Warren's 1990 essay, The Power and Promise of Ecological Feminism, considered by many to be a founding text in what is now called ecofeminism. It's not about climbing per se, but it's notable that such a widely cited essay in environmental ethics presents the relationship between climber and mountain as exemplary of that between humans and environments in general. Warren uses climbing analogically to make more abstract points about how social imaginaries shape environmental ethics. She distinguishes a sense understood in an androcentric colonial sense as conquests from those that climbers describe in more cooperative or relational terms. She draws a sharp contrast between, quote, an imposed conqueror type relationship and an emergent caring type relationship. But I'm not entirely convinced that these sinister conquest climbers exist. They sound more like figments of the public's imagination. And even if it is true that climbing suffers from a conqueror element, there are some serious costs to devaluing summiting in climbing culture in the name of women climbers, feminism, the environment, or all three. It means we don't take seriously the accounts of many women mountaineers whose expressed passion for the summit gets pushed under the rug when we insist that feminist climbing is about care and relationships, not winning or summits. Just as there's something absurd about imagining Reinhold Messner as anything less than absolutely focused on and committed to summiting, regardless of how much he talks about climbing as meditative and spiritual, for women climbers, there's no conflict between the value of winning, getting to the top at sometimes serious cost, and the value of how you play the game, questions of style, cooperation, environmental protection, and intentional personal growth. We can see this in the accounts of women high-altitude climbers who made history, like Arunima Sinha. Sinha, the first female amputee to summit Everest in 2013, found her way to climbing by dramatically different means than the corporate jock. This was the only way I could reclaim my voice, she says. 2 years before, in 2011, Sinha was thrown from a moving train by a group of men attempting to rob her. As she lay on the tracks calling for help, another train ran over her leg, shattering it beyond repair. Her horrifying account of the amputation in a nearby rural hospital includes the pharmacist having to donate his own blood for the procedure because there was no blood around, and a stray dog feasting on her removed leg. Still in her hospital bed, she heard pitying murmurs, "Who will marry you now?" Which, she says, left her no choice. The only thing she could do to move on from this loss was summit Mount Everest. As Sinha reached the summit, her porter informed her that her oxygen supply was critically low and advised her to turn around so she could save her life and try again later. Sinha responded that if she failed to summit this time, her life would not have been worth saving. Lakpa Sherpa, who has the most Everest summits of any woman, alive or dead, is currently looking for sponsorship for her 10th summit bid. One of 11 children, Sherpa has spent much of her life working for minimum wage and is a single mother of 3. These are among the many stories that defy the commonly held belief that the most dedicated and accomplished climbers are white, privileged, fully abled, still young men with corporate paychecks or fat sponsorships and the freedom to do whatever they want whenever they want. But summiting is absolutely key to these women climbers. The question is not whether or not to summit, but what summiting or excellence or training or passion or performance means in the context of a body, life, or culture driven by something other than capitalist definitions of optimization. In 2018, Shia Boyu became the second double amputee to summit Everest. At age 69, and over 40 years after he had lost both his feet to frostbite on his first failed Everest attempt. He tried 3 more times before finally summiting. After a battle with lymphoma, Boyu had sold his car and apartment in order to keep climbing. Unlike pro climbers, he had no sponsors. There are many such stories, perhaps few as dramatic, but many that show how very deeply the Everest summit signifies across divides of culture, nation, age, life story, and just about every other imaginable difference. Boyu's success came right after the Nepalese government lifted the ban on solo climbers, double amputees, and vision-impaired climbers summiting. Critics of the ban had argued that it was a violation of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Disabled Persons. In short, that to prohibit someone from climbing Everest is a human rights violation. Now, to ask the human right to what exactly misses the point of the legal argument, which is that the ban discriminated against disabled climbers. But no other mountain has provoked such a conversation, in which the idea that climbing is a human right has become intelligible. Mount Kailash in Tibet has never been summited, and climbing it is banned by the Chinese government. But this has not provoked foreign visitors to protest that the ban violates some fundamental right to climb. Other climbing closures are sometimes condemned on the grounds of rights of citizens, like when many complained that climbing Uluru in Australia, which is also used to be called Ayers Rock, and was closed to climbers permanently in October of 2019, was the right of every Australian. This is a picture of Uluru right before the closure, and you can see the climbers celebrating their final their final opportunities to get up there. Everest has been unique in that respect. In March 2020, both the Nepalese and Chinese governments announced that the 2020 climbing season was canceled due to COVID. Though people had been calling for a closing of Everest for several years, this was the first time that such a closure had happened. In the midst of the ongoing pandemic, And by the way, this is a photo that went viral, taken by Nims Purja, a famous professional climber, and this is from 2019. In the midst of the ongoing pandemic, as the media constantly announced its second wave, Nepal reestablished international flights and announced a new climbing season starting in August 2020. Reports predicted that the 2020-21 season would be busier and more crowded than ever, given the backlog of climbers who had missed out the year before because of COVID. But the temporary closure was a reminder that closures, even of mountains as lucrative as Everest, are possible. What if Everest went the way of Uluru and were closed to climbers forever? Such a move would be more complicated than it appears, and the complications are dramatically different for different communities. The loudest protests would undoubtedly come from climbers themselves, but not the most skilled ones who already have access to, and in many cases, interest in, the less frequented Himalayan peaks. On the contrary, if the Everest selfie phenomenon is any indication, the greatest emotional impact would be on climbers for whom Everest is the best or only Himalayan opportunity of their lives. Correspondingly, however, the greatest economic impact would be on the local Sherpa support community that has been built around Everest. Sherpas are pro-climbers in the truest sense, paid to guide others into the world of Everest, and many of them die while doing their jobs. Any move to permanently close off the summit or dramatically lower the number of permits issued each year would have to seriously consider the effect on Sherpa communities currently engaged in their own debates about their future as climbers. Large-scale relocations might be undertaken as if a natural disaster had occurred. In a sense, though, as we can see, a natural disaster is underway. This disaster consists not just of the traffic jam at the top or the high death count. It encompasses a vulnerable mountain environment that has ballooned with economic growth. Due to climate change, the Himalaya could use more than a third of their glaciers by the end of the century. This will have devastating consequences for the 1.665 billion people living in the mountains and in downstream countries, who are at risk of flooding and the destruction of crops. Between Himalayan warming, growth at its most abstract and hardest to mitigate, and the zoo and garbage dump, and these are quotes from the media, that there's a zoo and a garbage dump on Everest. Growth at its most obvious and tangible, the scale and complexity of the recent damage to the region is only now beginning to come into view. Everest is living proof that the limits of human desire for the good life have finally reached the top, the limits of what the world can handle. And so I return to this strange question. If there is a right to climb Everest, what part of the human does that right protect? And at what cost? In 2012, Kyle Maynard became the first quadruple amputee to bear crawl the 5,895 meters to the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro without the aid of prosthetics. He had 16 days for the ascent, but it took him 10, and it won Maynard his second Excellence in Sports Performance Yearly, his second ESPY award for Best Male Athlete with a Disability. 4 years later, he reached the summit of Argentina's Mount Aconcagua, the highest peak in both the Western and Southern hemispheres, standing at almost 7,000 meters. Following that summit, Nike featured Maynard in the commercial Unlimited Will, which debuted globally during the 2016 Olympics.
Here is a man working hard, pushing his limits. You got this?
I got this.
Cool, you got this. Wait, what? You don't have arms, but you don't have legs either.
Oh, really? I must have left him at home.
You left them at, dude, that's not funny. You're on top of a mountain. It's dangerous.
A celebrity athlete and in-demand motivational speaker, Maynard could easily fall prey to late capitalist optimizing logic. He often presents as the ultimate super crip, with no excuses as the mantra at the heart of his motivational speaking approach and the title of his autobiography. As such a figure, he and other mobility challenged climbers or paraclimbers are especially susceptible to the ways capitalism skims off the top when it comes to the very life of life, the reasons that people do things, the stuff that keeps us going in the face of adversity. From a distance, the superscript message is indistinguishable from the capitalist one. Keep pushing, try harder, and you too will achieve your dreams. Keep working, keep wanting, don't quit, just do it. But upon closer inspection, Maynard's message is more nuanced. First, it is packaged to children and veterans with physical challenges, not elite athletes like himself. Maynard's message of excellence and optimization is in service of a more diverse society, full of different kinds of bodies, creating a diversity of lives, rather than a narrow and over-normalized version of what counts as success. Refreshingly, it has nothing to do with accomplishment or even with the effort along the way. It has to do with a different kind of agency, something like a right to wanting things at all, except really wanting them, unspoiled by imaginaries of what one should want. And here's a quote from Maynard about this campaign in particular, about why he turned to mountaineering. Regardless of what's happened to you, you can still choose to create the life that you want, not just be overcome with a sense of loss and mediocrity. Regardless of who you are, you can still fight for the things that you want, end of quote. The message is for all of us, crippled as we are by an ever-present and growing sense of mediocrity, having failed to live the life that counts as a life worth living according to the dominant culture. It says that summiting need not be about summiting at all, but can also be a call to reinterrogate and thus reimagine what one really wants to do with one's time on this earth. And though answers will vary according to the person, the summiting goal allows for a common purpose, the right to ask this of oneself in the first place. If there is something like a universal right to climb, perhaps it's actually just the right to want something, in ever shorter supply as late capitalism feeds on desire. The Himalaya and Karakoram are once again open for business. Perhaps the most profound environmental impact of the present situation is that the very category of environmental impact is no longer appropriate to describe what's happening. Dynamics in which human bodies and environments mutually act on each other in this dramatically, this dramatically, with all of the interaction mediated by fantasies of what counts as having a life, require a better framework than mainstream environmentalism has been able to provide. What we have named the environmental crisis is not the one-way street of human impact and anthropogenic change, but includes action in the opposite direction as environmental loss drives and shapes imaginaries of the good life and optimal bodily performance. As actual life goals try to outrun or outclimb #life goals, those environments become sites of projection for the lives that we wish we had, causing them to become ever more endangered. The more fragile these environments become, the more that which they represent, the very life of life, becomes something vulnerable and receding. And I'm going to conclude with a quote from a philosopher that I think with quite a bit. His name is Willem Flusser, and I think this will be very interesting in our context here today. We are probably in a revolutionary situation, although we cannot get an overview and cannot say with certainty whether it is objectively revolutionary. And I like this quote because it allows us to kind of speak this revolutionary language, even though we are tired and confused. So it kind of speaks to a particular late capitalist affect while still pointing to the possibility of revolution. And I will end there. I thank you.
Thank you. I'm on mute, right? Yeah. Thank you very much, Margaret, for your intriguing presentation on mountains and desire. think everybody will agree with me, both those in person and online, that you're definitely pushing us to think outside of the box, especially in terms of how, mountains and climbing can be acts of resistance, especially, within the context of what we are talking about for, women rights, for folks, people with disabilities that do take, steps in terms of doing perhaps what we will call the impossible, but also that can be seen as act of resistance in terms of their lives. We'll take questions. We're almost at the end, but we'll take questions after the last presenter, who is a University of Dayton student, Maria Zaki, who is sitting right next to me, is a senior at the University of Dayton and is majoring in international studies alongside minors in human rights, Arabic and Middle East and Islamic studies. She is an intern at the Human Rights Center, and we work closely together. And her goal is to strive for making long-lasting contributions as a global citizen in an ever-changing world. Maria?
Thank you for the introduction. It will be hard to follow up after such well-versed speakers, but I'll try to do my best. As Satang said, my name is Maria, and I am currently a senior here at the University of Dayton. I've been working at the center for over a year now, which I'm very thankful for, and I hope to continue this work in the future in my vocations and whatnot. And I just want to say that I chose international studies because both of my parents are Egyptian immigrants, so I felt that it would be the perfect realm for academics with diverse individuals and having different backgrounds. And Dr. Mesami is the head of this symposium, along with other wonderful professors who have helped me gain these majors and minors along my time here at the university. So with a little bit of background about myself, we'll go to the next slide. And this is a rough outline of what I plan to speak on today. The first being our international studies capstone, which Dr. Jaffe guided and supported us through. And little did herself or we know that the protests of Masa Amini would unfold in the following weeks, as our class could have chosen another area of focus, which was Belarus, as many of you know, in Eastern Europe. It was ironic timing, not only in terms of the political climate, but even on a global scale. The World Cup brought a lot of attention to countries that are otherwise often forgotten or overlooked. And I'm sure many of you know or have a baseline knowledge of what academic freedom is, which I will discuss further in my following slides and related to the cases of our scholars and their work. Then I would like to focus on the different approaches we took towards advocacy and how those approaches were either successful or could have been altered in a better approach. Lastly, I would like to wrap up and conclude with how these takeaways can be applied to the context of Iran or other places where human rights are in question and or in danger. At the top of this slide, as you can see here, is the official logo for Scholars at Risk and a short quote from our university website that basically summarizes what a capstone intends to be within the context of our university. Scholars at Risk, short for SARS, is a US-based international network of academic institutions organized to support and defend the principles of academic freedom and more broadly defend the rights of scholars around the world. Their network includes over 530 higher education institutions across 42 different countries. The extensiveness of their network exemplifies the wide threat on academic freedom and the need to defend it. As I mentioned earlier, I will briefly touch upon what academic freedom is before relating it to our cases. Attached here is a short quote from the University of California, which formally defines the term, but in short, it is the protection of teachers, students, and universities from job loss, imprisonment, and at times even death. On a personal note, I've always loved being a student, aside from math classes, so it is hard for me to fathom that the joy of education can be stripped from so many young and aspiring individuals. Upon being in touch with Adam Braver, who is the Student Advocacy Seminars Coordinator for SARS, we learned about the two cases that we will be dealing with over the course of our fall semester. The first is that of Nilofar Bayani, who worked with the Persian Wildlife Heritage Foundation in Iran, focusing on conservation efforts and endangered cheetah research. She is an Iranian wildlife conservation biologist, researcher, and advocate. Unfortunately, in 2018, Bayani was convicted of espionage by Iranian authorities in a closed-door trial and received a 10-year sentence in notorious Evin prison. She has confessed guilty to these crimes, but later expressed that her confessions were coerced. She frequently wrote letters from prison describing the tortures and abuses she was facing, including but not limited to sexual assault. She even wrote an open letter to the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, which one can safely assume was unsuccessful in bringing any form of justice to her or other similar cases. The second case, the scholar that my group focused on for the semester, was that of Dr. Ahmad Reza Dajali. And after Dajali attended an academic conference in April of 2016 at the University of Tehran related to his work on disaster medicine, Dajali was arrested without a warrant due to accusations of spying on Israel and, you guessed it, spreading corruption on earth. His confessions were also obtained through torture and coercion, yet he is currently sentenced to death. In addition to the involvement of the EU, 14 different academic and rights groups have issued a statement regarding the severity of his deteriorating health and torture inside of Evin prison. I recently learned that Evin prison is jokingly called Evin University, considering the number of scholars and activists that they currently have locked up. We had more generalized goals in the beginning of this experience, but as time went on and we slowly learned, we needed to make realistic, tangible goals that would prove effective, even if that effect was only limited to our community. A lot of this work tends to be broad and has a wide scope of issues and approaches. Instead of getting overwhelmed, we brainstormed ideas together and employed the ones that we thought would be most successful. We had 2 table sessions outside of our busy KU ballroom, which, as many of you know, generate a lot of student traffic during the weekdays. We created an advocacy letter template for students to take home with them or for their friends, gathered signatures from all over campus, including students, faculty, and staff, friends from afar, which for our petition, which I will share in later slides. We wanted people to understand the importance of this issue, even if it does not directly affect them. I personally think that people should not be waiting around until something horrific happens in their own context. This individualistic attitude completely undermines the focus of human rights and advocacy in general. These are just a few of the posters and flyers that our class had generated and posted throughout campus. We put them in the law building, the library, and on our way to various classes. We try not to overwhelm the flyers with information since, as we know from our own experience, that busy students don't often take the time to read fine print. Attached here is both a QR code and a link that will take you directly to the petition that we created, which currently has 325 signatures from around the world, including from Iran, Sweden, and a range of states within the US. While you take a moment to look at this, I will wrap up my presentation by speaking on the results and lessons we've learned from this advocacy work, which can be found on the left side of the screen. I would also like to clarify that these are not only my takeaways, but from my classmates as well who experienced this opportunity with me. Unfortunately, Ms. Mediza could not join us today, but thanks to Dr. Mendoza, I am able to incorporate a few important points that she wanted to bring up, which were directly in line with the majority of what we learned from this capstone. The first point being that we need to take advantage of the technological times we live in. Hashtags help amplify voices of political prisoners, especially when they are in particular risk, such as the case of Dr. Dajali. This brings a lot of unwanted attention on a regime that doesn't want to lose its credibility among the international community. They have paused most executions due to the extreme levels of attention they are currently receiving. Secondly, the more pressure that U.S. representatives receive to support the people of Iran, the better. I put this point in red because a few of my classmates and I are fortunate enough to travel to Washington, D.C. at the end of the month and for this specific reason. We plan to meet Adam Braver in person, other student advocacy groups from different universities or with different cases, and meet with congressmen and our representatives to speak about our cases. This will be an educational and immersive experience for us to be able to take our advocacy to the next level and better learn how to present these cases in politically charged spaces. Lastly is the issue of donations. Many of these organizations are actually affiliates of the regime, and even though they position themselves as nonprofits advocating for the rights and aid of Iranians, in short, donations to these organizations ultimately help the regime either directly or indirectly. As I mentioned earlier, we did conduct an interview with a local Iranian store owner in Beaver Creek. The store owner and her friend attended our Roche Symposium presentation at the end of the semester with great enthusiasm. At the end of our presentation, they spoke for about 25 minutes about their personal experiences in Iran and how affected themselves and their families are by the current political unrest. While we read extensive amounts on the political, social, and cultural climate of Iran, nothing was more impactful or more informative than hearing these firsthand accounts. I am very grateful that they came, supported us, and spoke from their own positionality. I bring this up because one point they repeatedly emphasized was do not donate. The Iranian people do not want money or need money, especially when that money never reaches the people it's intended to help. Instead, they want people to listen, to them, to each other, and to the cries of the country that is currently being beaten down by its own regime. So that is the end of my presentation, but I would like to thank the University of Dayton, the Human Rights Center, and Dr. Saya Mesami for being the head of this symposium and putting this event all together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for your wonderful presentation. I think, your professors are in the room. I'm sure everybody is proud of your presentation, but also that you're able to showcase the actions that the INS capstone students were able to do with regard to the work on with scholars at risk, but also being able to illustrate, for instance, how small actions and ways in which students, as well as activists and scholars and, people in the community, the everyday person, can contribute in small ways to showing solidarity as well as taking action, especially within the issues that we've seen in Iran as well as elsewhere. At this point, we're almost at the end, and I would like to open it up for questions in the chat as well as those online, but also in the room as well. If you have any questions, I know it's almost the end of the day, and I just wanted to extend our appreciation for people staying both online as well as in person with us in this very important symposium as well. Do we have any questions in the room?
My name is Mogo Kisula. I'm from Democratic Republic of Congo. And my question was the way Professor Saki, she was addressing that some country like Africa, that is example, but she was explaining about the Muslim countries, about women, but sometimes it is a religious culture. So that is why people, they are acting. So my question is, how they can act to change those situations? I don't know how they answer, what the solution they can take to change so that women, they can have human rights like other people, other countries. Which step they can take? Because at my place, they are the same, like the way she explaining.
Thank you very much. Do we have any additional questions? I'll let the presenters answer, but I think I will perhaps add another question as a general question to everybody in terms of how. Oh, Paul, you have a question? Okay, I was muted. I'm back. Anyway, so I was saying that I'm just gonna add Yeah, I was going to wrap up with a general question, especially drawing from the words of Niloufar, especially in terms of how do we, in our own spaces, amplify the agency of women and girls, especially with regard to the exercise of their agency of power, the agency of participation, and the agency of freedom. And we'll wrap up, and then we'll hand it over back to the convener of the symposium to wrap it up. So Niloufar, if you want to go first, and then we have Margaret and Maria, if you have any additional comment, and then we'll hand it back to Saya. Thank you.
Thank you. A very good question. Thank you for that. I think there are two ways. At our own small spaces, I worked in Afghanistan for a number of years with communities, with women groups, and with the very rural areas also that were traditional, religious, and not accepting any change. So I work with them, and I have seen myself how those particular activities that I did with the team of us, how that brought changes at the community level. So one of the major tactics that we use, participation. We brought more women into the trainings, into the we introduced them to media and education institutions, and there were exposure visits in the center of the cities that we encouraged the families. I personally talked to the fathers and to the religious elders to enable women and to let women come to city to visit the institutions, to visit the other groups who were very active in society. So that bringing women and enabling environment for the party for demonstration of their presence, I think that's important, and that happens through participation as much as possible. I mean, at every space. If men are in charge or women are in charge of our own small spaces or capacity that we have, I think we need to bring more women in whatever capacity we have in whatever organization we work in. And what, for example, the trainings that we do, the participation of more women could be effective. And though there are at the political level, let me give an example of Afghanistan. There was a quota system for women in parliament. There was a quota system for women in certain government institution. I think that was at the beginning, of course, that was symbolic because it was just to show that, okay, women are there, but then women, based on my interview with many of them, women were not having a decision-making power at many of those institutions. But again, at a very traditional society, that is a good first step. The quota system, to include women, the presentation is important. I mean, women should be everywhere, and social aspect, and social sector, and public sector, political and economic sector. So their presence initially, even if it is based on quota or something, that's very, very important. And then through that participation and presence, I think they can push for more decision-making role. And that happened in many contexts around the world that I was engaged with women. First, they made entries, and then when the entries were ensured, then they pushed and pushed and pushed through, and it took years, by the way. It's not an easy process. It took years for their voices to be heard at a policy circle or decision-making circle. So the quota system, the participation initially in traditional societies, that makes a lot of sense. And the second important thing, institutionalization of women's rights in traditional societies. That's very important. I think in my presentation, I referred to it, that how politics impact building narratives around women rights in society, and how that impacts the social belief system, perceptions about women's role in society. The politics does play a role. The politicians does play a role. The ruling system, power system, that does play a role. Therefore, I think any, if we are in politics, if any of us, or if men who are fighting for women's rights, they are in politics, they should start institutionalization by what? By including, by enabling environment for women to come in politics first, by policies and laws and bills that are women's friendly. So these are institutionalization where you enable women to participation in political institutions and the ruling positions and decision-making positions, and also supporting laws and policies that are women's friendly, that enable more women to be in private sector and in social economic sector. So I think institutionalization of women's rights in traditional society, that should happen at the top, and at the very grassroots, middle level, middle range society, there's again participation by the actors who are working with different sectors of society. That's also an important step too, that I think could bring. But again, with that all said, this is not easy. It's a time, it requires time, and especially based on my personal experience of working in a number of countries where tradition and religion and custom and norms and values of societies are based on patriarchal system, that makes our work very, very, very challenging and difficult. But again, it's not impossible. The push and resistance and work and bringing women more and cooperation. These are, I think, some of the tactics and techniques that I have used in my work and proved to be productive in some part of the world that I work with.
Very much. Margaret, did you get? Okay. Thank you again, everyone, or to all of our wonderful speakers for this very interesting panel. I should have done this before, but I'll do it at the end. My name is Tatang Nawane, the Director of Programs at the Human Rights Center, and I was your moderator for the last session. At this point, I will hand it back to the convener of the symposium for any last words, as well as to wrap up this very wonderful but timely symposium. Thank you, everyone.
Hello again. It's been a couple of hours. I was not supposed to speak at the end, but I'll take advantage of this opportunity to thank our wonderful panelists for very illuminative, inspiring, and informative talks. I think the questions that I posed in the very beginning of today's symposium were all answered. I think I know much more than before. I think that this might be the case for everybody else who attended this symposium, either online or in person. I would like to thank again University of Dayton, the Human Rights Center, the International Studies Program, and the Department of Philosophy for sponsoring this symposium. And hopefully the online version will be published soon also, and we can disseminate that so more and more people can enjoy and learn from the wonderful ideas and information that we were provided with our great panelists. So thank you all again, and we can call it a day. It was a long day. You can clap for yourself.